Hello, here we are again, Zion, for another devotional. Just want to say on behalf of Pastor John and Chris and the leadership team here at Red Lion Zion that we continue to miss you. We're praying for you every day, and we hope that as things get lifted, we will be back together soon. So stay strong in your faith and keep praying with us, and hopefully things will be changing here very soon. The last couple of devotionals, last couple of weeks I should say, we've been talking about this dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, and Jesus trying to get them to understand what's going to happen with him, especially pointing towards his ascension towards the end of these couple of chapters. And they're really having a hard time. They're struggling with what he's telling them. If we go back a little ways, a couple weeks, to John 14, we talked about Jesus saying, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." And as he finished his speech to them at that particular point, he says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." So through him we find that as long as we're grounded in him, we're attached to him, we can find our peace. We can have peace no matter what comes our way. So then last week we talked about John 15, which in there, if you remember, it was the vine and the gardener and the branches. And the vine being Christ, the gardener being his Father, and the branches being, at this point, the disciples and us. And we learned that word remain, to remain or abide in him, means to stay in relationship with or to stay connected to him. Why? Because that's where our source of life comes from. It'll enable us to bear fruit, the right kind of fruit. The Father, being a gardener, is going to prune away these bad habits and attitudes and practices that combat with us in this life and battle with the Spirit within us. In verse 11 of that chapter, he says, "I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." So we find that maintaining that connection, we have not only peace, but we can find our joy there. And this week I want to continue on to the next chapter, which is John 16. I want to start by reading verse 5. He says, "Now I am going to him who sent me. Yet none of you ask me, 'Where are you going?' Rather, you are filled with grief because I have said these things." So if you remember, when we first started talking about this dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, Jesus would tell them some things, and then one of the disciples would say, "I have a question." And Jesus would listen to the question and answer it. Well, now we come to this point where Jesus is saying, you're filled with grief because I've said these things. None of you are asking me any more questions. I kind of thought about that because I remember back in the elementary school years, and even the high school years, where the teacher would be telling us things and people would be raising their hands, but then eventually it'd come to a point where you might turn to the person next to you and say, "What did he mean by that?" Because you're afraid to ask the question again. I think maybe this is where the disciples were at, and they just really were unsure, uncertain of what he was saying, but also maybe not wanting to believe that what he was saying was actually going to come true because they had spent a lot of time with Jesus, and for him to be leaving, wow, just didn't sit well with them. But if we look back, what is happening here is they are filled with grief because he is telling them these things. They had forgotten that promise back in John 14 about not letting their hearts be troubled and not being afraid. Let's look at verses 16 through 20 of that same chapter, John 16. It says, "In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me." Some of his disciples said to one another, here they are talking back and forth to one another, "What does he mean by saying, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? And because I am going to the Father." They kept asking, "What does he mean by a little while? We don't understand what he's saying." Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this, so he said to them, "Are you asking one another what I meant when I said, 'In a little while'? you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me? I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. So here we see that disciples begin talking amongst themselves because they're not understanding what Jesus is saying, or again, it's really shocking to them that he's going to leave them. And the question is, what does he mean by a little while? But even though there's a level of grief here, their grief will be turned into joy, according to the words of Jesus. If we move a little further into that chapter, and we look at verses 25 through 33, we have these words. Though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language, but will tell you plainly about my Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I am not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and entered the world. Now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. Then Jesus' disciples said, now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. And Jesus says, you believe at last? Jesus answered this to them, but a time is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So what we see here is Jesus is actually now helping his disciples understand. He tells them exactly what's going to happen. In verse 28, I came from the Father and entered the world. I came down from heaven, entered the world. Now I am going to leave the world and go back to my Father. He's pointing towards his ascension, which is what we would celebrate next Thursday, would be Ascension Day. And then following that, 10 days later would then be Pentecost. So he's helping them understand this by taking out the figures of speech and speaking more clearly. So the disciples even said to him, well, now you're speaking clearly and without these figures of speech. So now we got it. We understand. And Jesus says, you believe at last. Even though they believe, there's still some uncertainty, some doubt there that's going to follow, because Jesus is saying that, you know what, time is coming when you will be scattered to your own homes. You will leave me all alone. See, when we lose faith, it can scatter us, and we can lose that connection with Christ, as we talked about him being a vine and we being branches, being connected to him. When we let that fear and doubt come in and it breaks our faith, then we can become disconnected. So we need to maintain that faith. We need to maintain that connection and find our peace and joy in him. Now, I like Jesus' honesty when it comes to verse 33. Not that he was never honest, but I like what he has to say as he sums this up. And I'll just read that again. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. But then he says, in this world you will have trouble. And, well, you know, who can dispute that? We will have trouble, and we're going to have trouble. But yet, you know, hey, life is not a cakewalk. It's never, you know, nobody ever said, yes, it's going to be easy. And it's filled with, you know, the highs and the lows. And we go through them sometimes very small in our daily walk, and sometimes on a larger scale like we're doing right now. So the only way to persevere through it all is to maintain that connection with Christ and to have that strength of faith so that we know that he's working everything according to the counsel of his will. And we need to trust and continue to trust in him so that we may have peace and become the overcomers that he wants us to be. And the only way we can do that, to overcome this world and the situations, is to maintain that connection and to maintain that strength of faith. So with that, I want to go ahead and end with prayer. Lord Jesus, may we find peace and joy in you, especially in these trying times and in our little highs and lows of each day. We want to stay connected to you, the vine. May our words and actions align with your will. Thank you for helping us understand how difficult this world can be at times. Help us to bear fruit, to bring you glory, to strengthen our faith, and help us to be a reflection of you to this world. We just lift up our leaders, just grant them wisdom and understanding to lead us through this pandemic. And Father, just pray that we would not only have the strength of faith, but the patience to bear under these changing times and the changes that this pandemic has brought. And may we just offer up those prayers for our leaders in churches, in businesses, on a national level, Father. But we just ask that you would help, that you would lead us through this, and you would keep us safe. We ask these things in Jesus' name.